Hello everyone, and welcome to another cartography lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to wrap up our discussion on projections by talking about being able to select the appropriate projection for a given application. And essentially what's nice about this is that with the abundance of resources and literature out now, selecting the right projection basically boils down to addressing the following three questions and then looking up your answers in some charts. Now, what I want to make of note here is that we're basically going to be applying what is called the Snyder's map projection guidelines. And I like these guidelines because I think that, again, they basically boil down to answering three key questions. You have to answer them correctly, but answering three key questions, looking up some values in a table, and it will give you a pretty solid indication of how you want to go about picking the proper projection. And then it just becomes an issue of adjusting your tangent line or your secant lines appropriately. So let's go ahead and break down these three questions. The first question is the most important, and that's what scale of geography am I looking at? What level of geography are you planning to map? And basically what it boils down to is there's four answers. So let's take a look at that question first. What is my geographic scale? And basically, you have four choices. One is global. Are you trying to map the entire globe on a single map? That's the biggest level of geographic scale you can have. The second is hemisphere. Hemisphere meaning northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, or maybe you're doing eastern hemisphere, western hemisphere, right? You're basically doing half of the globe. Versus a hemisphere, right? You're doing half the globe. Finally, you get to this idea of an individual continent. / ocean. So again, this would basically be focusing on a continent. And then finally, you get to something like a state in the United States or a country elsewhere in the globe, or smaller. Now, these three, global, hemisphere, and continental, are going to be covered under Snyder's. This country or smaller, this is going to be covered under what's called state plane or UTM, which are basically going to be very, very specific projections that are actually by design, because of the scale that you're working at, are going to have minimal distortion. So we don't really have to worry about them as much in terms of distortion. If you're working with, say, a single county, that is most likely going to be either in state plane or UTM, which we'll be talking about in the next video. But again, what geography am I looking at? Whole world, half the world, or a specific continent? Any of these three, we're going to go back and we're going to look at these Snyder's tables that we'll talk about momentarily. Okay? Global, hemisphere, continent. That's question one. Question two. What distortion property am I trying to preserve? All right, so question two. What distortion property am I trying to preserve? We've already talked about this in the previous video where we outlined those four types of distortions. So basically you have to think to yourself, what property is most important to me and what I'm trying to do? Does my mapping application require me to calculate areas? Because if it does, I should be preserving area. If I'm trying to show the specific shape of something, I'm going to want to go with a conformal projection. If I'm really worried about the directions to a specific point, I'm going to choose azimuthal. So what property am I trying to preserve really requires you to stop and think about what the goal of your map is. What specific attribute is going to be most important for making that map accurately. Okay? And then finally, orientation or key characteristic. This is basically going to be what is the primary directionality of my map. Is what I'm trying to map wider than it is long? Actually, let's go ahead and write that down. Right, so this is going to basically be things like, is my mapped area longer in one direction? Right, so this is going to get back to that idea of aspect, right? Do we want the map to be oriented vertically, like north-south, or do we want it to be oriented horizontally, east-west, right? And that's going to determine based on whether or not your geography extends more in one direction than the other. And again, I go back to that example of the United States, right? It's longer than it is tall, so we would want something that would be more suited for east-west, versus South America is longer than it is wide, so we would want something that is oriented for north-south. This would also include any key characteristics such as how do we deal with what's called interrupted map projections. Basically, an interrupted map projection allows the map projection to be broken, especially in the oceans, and then that's going to introduce distortion when we fill in those gaps, or maybe we don't fill in those gaps. And that's going to have interpretation implications towards the end user. Right, so this is going to be both in terms of the orientation, but also is there anything in particular that we need to be aware of to improve the end user's ability to interpret the map. Okay, so again, 3 key questions: geographic scale, distortion you're trying to preserve, and orientation. And so I mentioned that we are going to be using Snyder's map projection guidelines as a means to be able to pick the proper projection. So let's go ahead and take a look at what those tables look like. So what I want to do now is I've opened a copy of tables 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3 from the textbook. And these are just the Snyder's map projection guidelines. And I'm not going to go into super specific detail here, but I want to walk through sort of how you use these tables based on those 3 questions that we talked about before. And basically the way that it works is you answer that first question, what is the geographic scale? And that's going to determine which table you go to. If you're talking about the world, you're going to go to table 9.1. Again, it says region mapped world. If you're going to be talking about a hemisphere, right, you're going to go to the 9.2 where it says region mapped hemisphere. And then if you're talking about a continent, ocean, or something of that size, you're going to go to table 9.3 where it says continent, ocean, or smaller. Then you need to think about that second question, what key property am I trying to preserve? And you can see here that this is going to break it up even further. So if you're worried about shape, right, you're going to stick to these ones underneath the conformal property, right? And then you're going to have to ask yourself, what other key characteristics am I thinking about? And this is going to be, again, that idea of the aspect. Do I care more about something east-west, north-south, or some other angle? Right? And that's going to determine then, once you've answered that question, you'll get a named projection. And this named projection here, this is going to be what you're going to search for in ArcGIS Pro. Same thing down here with the hemisphere. right? You're going to say, what property am I concerned with? In this case, shape or area, and you're going to get a name. And then again, you're going to use this name to look up in ArcGIS Pro to figure out what projection you should use. And again, with regions, right now we're getting into that idea of east-west, north-south, or some other angle, where you're at, whether you're near the equator or away from the equator, and then what property, again, shape or area. So hopefully these tables aren't too complicated. And then if you're talking about a state, you're going to get into state plane or UTM. Hopefully this makes sense. And if you have any questions, as always, please reach out. Thank you.